blockade, those were big factors and among the first ones listed when the government said it needed the act. I expect that we'll hear more on that from the Prime Minister, because he was on the phone with Joe Biden, as were several of his ministers, with American officials in the White House and in the administration saying, what's going on up there? When are you guys going to get a handle on this? And we heard that there were sort of key investment decisions happening at that very time. So the government, it seems to feel we're in jeopardy at one point.
How would you describe the approach of the lawyers for the convoy? Because they've had also the opportunity to question those senior ministers this week.
Goodness, what I can say about that, I think, is you'll see it reflected in what the judge did with some of their requests this week for yet more witnesses, yet more documents, or having redactions lifted in documents. Look, they have floated a very strange, and there's no other way to call it, a conspiracy theory that pulled in all kinds of disparate elements, a lobby firm in Canada, accusing it of being connected to a plan by liberal political staffers who were trying to coordinate with this firm and the media to plant, a Nazi flag in the demonstrations in order to taint all the protesters as Nazis or extremists, in order to bring down the hammer of emergency powers. It betrayed a really fundamental lack of understanding of who does what here in terms of government structure. There's political researchers are paid by taxpayers in the opposition and the government to bring forward good policy and good political thinking into policy making in this place. But they've concocted a whole grand scheme, a narrative, they say, that was being created by the government, and there's been no evidence for it.
Prime Minister will testify tomorrow, the Deputy Prime Minister today. What are you going to be watching for?
Well, look, we know a lot about what the government thought was the risks and the dangers, but there's a lot we don't still know about how that rose to the level of being a national emergency, both legally and in their minds. And in particular, I think from the Prime Minister, I would like to hear how he was processing, the fact that on that crucial weekend when they were weighing the act, and on Sunday night and Monday morning, February 13th and February 14th, when they were actually thinking about triggering the act, things were happening. There was going to be the raid in Coutts that presumably would have ended up ending that blockade. The Windsor Bridge had been cleared and traffic was opening after midnight that Sunday night into Monday. The Ottawa police did have finally, after more than 2 weeks, nearly 3 weeks, a plan to deal with the Ottawa blockade of downtown Ottawa. To what extent did the government know the details, or even if that was in place? One of the things we learned this week is that that was actually not brought to cabinet, the fact that that was in existence. So what did he know, and what did they understand legally they were empowered to do? They were clearly warned after the premiers talked to Trudeau, and many objected to the use of the act. They were clearly told that if you use this act, it is vulnerable to challenge.
We'll watch to see what the Prime Minister says. We're out of time, but I have to ask you about, you mentioned the text messages. One of the things is, well, we know a lot because of these text messages that have been revealed from people like Marco Mendicino to David Lametti, accusatory texts from the former Premier of Alberta. What do you make of the level of disclosure that we're seeing right now?
It's extraordinary. I've never seen it. In all my years in Ottawa, I've never seen, that behind the scenes sausage making in a way. And also, we're learning stuff. We're learning. The Justice Minister had floated the Emergency Act was in play from the get-go. So it's fascinating. And, just the level of sort of infighting between governments. I mean, the Ontario Solicitor General barking at the federal Solicitor General saying, you're not the boss of me?
With stronger language than that.
I'm being polite. It's crazy.
It is quite something. Tonda, we will continue to watch and we'll talk again. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt.
Tonda McCharles is a parliamentary reporter for the Toronto Star. Dick Fadden is a former director of CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, former National Security Advisor to Prime Ministers Harper and Trudeau. Kara Zwiebel is representing the Canadian Civil Liberties Association at the Public Order Emergency Commission. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Dick, a key question, not just this week, but over the course of this entire inquiry, is whether the convoy posed enough of a threat to the security of this nation to justify invoking the Emergencies Act. From your perspective, has the government made a reasonable assessment of the threat that was posed in that moment?
I think on balance it has, and I think it's not just the convoy in Ottawa, it's all of the blockades or the demonstrations across the country. Things that we haven't really come to grips with yet is the extent to which they were coordinated, or at least information was exchanged, because that's one of the big issues today in any public order disturbance, is the extent to which there's coordination and then the development of groupthink. But I would argue that, demonstrations which turned into blockades, where there's the possibility of violence, there's the possibility of an attempt to overthrow the government, there are threats of harm to the Prime Minister. Taken together, I think it was not only justified, I think in the end they had to do something. To my mind, the real issue is, how did we, a G7 country, a very sophisticated country with a great deal of respect for the law, get ourselves into the situation where we did invoke the Emergencies Act? To my mind, that's the really central question. Since the government's invocation of the Emergencies Act has already been sustained by the House of Commons, I think the key now is to make sure this never, ever happens again.
Cara, the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General, David Lametti, argued that even though the Emergencies Act uses the same definition of a national security threat as CSIS, the Cabinet should be able to interpret that definition more broadly. And the head of CSIS himself believed that. What do you make of that argument?
Well, it's hard to know what to make of it, because of course the basis for it is not being shared with the Commission and the public. And I think that it's true, as Tonda said, there has been an extraordinary amount of disclosure of sort of behind the scenes text messages and things like that. And while it's interesting and maybe some of it is a little salacious, to me, what's more important, and what the government had said from the outset it was going to give the Commission, were the inputs that Cabinet considered in making this decision. And although I understand there's a different privilege that attaches to a legal opinion, that legal opinion is an input that Cabinet considered, and I think it's a pretty important one for the Commission to know. Broadly,
though, should Cabinet be able to interpret that definition of a public emergency more broadly than what CSIS might have it as the letter of that definition, if there are, as we heard, threats to national security, but also we heard possible threats to the economy as well?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that that was threats to the economy. It was something that was potentially contemplated and rejected when the Emergencies Act was created. There was a very deliberate linking of the definition in the Emergencies Act to the definition in the CSIS Act, and it was a linking that was allowed to evolve, so that if the definition in the CSIS Act changed, the definition in the Emergencies Act would change as well. So no, I mean, I think that you have to take the law on its face and use the words as they appear on the page. That doesn't mean, and I think that this was pointed out by Commission Counsel yesterday, there's been a bit of a straw man argument that people are saying CSIS was allowed to decide. CSIS had a veto over this. That's not the argument at all. I think everyone understands this was a decision for the government to make. But the words on the page mean what they say.
What about the threat of violence? Again, Bill Blair and Marco Mendicino